Also unfolding this morning, the IDF has been forced to apologize after shocking photos emerged of Palestinians who had been detained, men, military-age men who had been detained. And these humiliating photos came out that many people recalled, it was like Abu Ghraib 2.0. The nature of these, they were stripped down to their underwear, blindfolded, hands bound, forced to kneel, et cetera. And initially, so the IDF is claiming, hey, we weren't the ones that released these photos. Well, someone among your ranks obviously were the ones that released these photos. Initially, they were saying, oh, these are all Hamas militants who surrendered. Now they're admitting that, according to their numbers, which take this with a million grains of salt, they say it was only 10 to 15% of these men were actually Hamas militants. And they said that although it had been necessary to strip them to ensure they weren't carrying explosives, showing the photos was needless and humiliating after a global outcry. Let's go ahead and put these photos up on the screen so you can see what we're talking about. For those of you who are just listening, this is a video that you can see here of these men stripped down to their underwear on the ground. These individuals are being forced to kneel also in their underwear with their hands bound. These are being transported in trucks. And again, the original story we're getting is, oh, these are all Hamas militants who are surrendering. You can see this man who is carrying a gun, and he is coming forward and laying it down. One of the immediate questions that emerged here is you're about to see another version of this same video, and Al Jazeera and others reporting that it appears they made this man do this twice for their little propaganda video that they're filming here. And this man has been identified as a small business owner, by the way, with no known ties to Hamas. So that's where we are. Let's go ahead and put this next piece up on the screen. The Israeli military originally said on Thursday it had apprehended hundreds of people suspected of terrorism. Of course, now they are walking all of that back. And NBC reported on who these men actually were. So even before Israel admitted that many of these men were civilians, you can see this individual who's circled here. This is a journalist. This is a journalist for At the New Arabs Arabic Service. Others are relatives of a DC-based fundraiser for a UN agency. So people were able to spot civilians in these pictures. Mainstream outlets actually, did journalism and exposed that these were not, in fact, all Hamas militants. And I think that's what pressured the IDF to actually come out and have to apologize and acknowledge that they claim some of them were Hamas militants. You can take that with a grain of salt. But it's important to remember also what they were originally saying when they were originally pressed on these photos, which spread like wildfire and can have tremendously radicalizing impacts, not to mention just, the immoral nature of humiliating these men who, most of whom did nothing wrong. Mark Regev, who's a senior advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, was questioned by Sky News on why they did this and what exactly was going on here. Just listen to his response.
What was the purpose of the exercise that was going on at that point in that part of Gaza?
First of all, remember it's the Middle East and it's warmer here, and especially during the day when it's sunny, it's to be asked to take off your shirt. It might not be pleasant, but it's not the end of the world.
But the fact that some of those who were taken in that particular incident have now been released suggests that they were not members of Hamas. And whilst you were entitled to round people up in that manner, what the IDF is not entitled to do under the Geneva Convention is breach the third convention, which you did, didn't you, when you filmed them in those positions.
So once again, I don't think we're talking about formal material that was released, and we have to look to how the video did.
If it proves to have been filmed by the IDF, that's neither here nor there. Neither is the temperature in the Middle East right now.
I understand. But I think that the important thing here is to remember these are military-aged men who were arrested in a combat zone. And as you've reported, people have already been released. We have no intention of keeping innocent people in custody.
Which I agree with. And I'm sorry to press you on this point, but if people have been released because they are not members of Hamas, if this was filmed by the IDF, it is a clear breach of the Geneva Convention, is it not?
So once again, we have to look into where the video came from. It's not official video that was released by the State of Israel.
If it were filmed by the IDF, as I just said, it would be a breach of the Geneva Convention, would it not?
So I'm not familiar with that level of international law.
Well, it's the Middle East. It's warm, and I don't really understand international law.
This is the other problem.
So.
Well, then here's the other thing. And take all your soldiers' phones away, because who else is behind a machine gun, which is an IDF convo, is taking pictures of these guys and spreading it on social media.
Yep.
That's something that U.S. soldiers have learned a long time ago in taking their phones away from these people,
And
because
by
you
the
probably
way-
shouldn't be trusting 22-year-olds with them.
And by the way, listen, the IDF was also bragging about how they were rounding up militants, so I don't totally take them at face value either when they say they're so unhappy with these photos being spread.
So let's actually just get to the crux of it. I mean, I think there's a reasonable question. Or like, okay, well, there's a justification here about the visual check for a suicide bomber and for a suicide vest. I think that's entirely reasonable, actually. I looked, though, to people who actually served in the U.S. military during Iraq, especially at the time, 2004 and onward, when we had to deal with a very similar situation. And actually, one of the generals who was in charge at that time, Major General Charlie Herbert, who's now retired. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. He was part of the coalition inside of Iraq, and this was the analysis he gave. He says, quote, "I don't question the need for visual checks for suicide vests. That's standard operating procedure when dealing with a suspected bomber. But in 34 years of challenging infantry soldiering, I have never once seen scenes like this in the IDF photos, not once. Do a cursory online search and trying to find equivalents. ISIS, maybe. Abu Ghraib, but you will not find many photos of soldiers in a democratically elected nation treating suspects like that. Don't suggest that it is a standard practice. It looks far more to me like a determined and deliberate effort to humiliate, degrade, and dehumanize. It is not 1/millionth as bad as what Hamas did on October 7th, but that's not the point, is it?" So I really look to the people who professionally were in charge of that situation. And one of the things that has also come out, and I went back and checked as well, is that the FDF initial release, SDF, which were the Syrian Democratic Forces, which were the US-backed coalition against ISIS, whenever they would round up literal ISIS fighters who, let's all remember, those are the guys who were responsible for enslaving and raping their wives. And even they did not strip them, and they would line them up and make sure that they didn't have their arms. They would separate women and children. But even amongst the men, they largely, I wouldn't say they're treated humanely per se, but they were not treated in a similar fashion. And that were people who I think have the best justification for just shooting all these people in the head. And that's the problem, I think, for Israel, is that from a recruiting level, this is going to be a real problem. And it's already spread across WhatsApp, across the entire Arab world, which is far more online today and they were in 2004. You can ask any person who was in command in 2004, 2005 in Iraq. The Al-Qaeda in Iraq and all of the Islamic propagandists, Abu Ghraib was the #1 recruiting tool that they had. Those photos that they published and spread everywhere, and which U.S. commanders eventually, at least I guess to our credit, we apologized for it, and we were like, look, this is totally against everything that we stand for. I forget what that woman's name was, Lindsay or whatever. She was, I believe they were court-martialed and they were brought before military justice. The U.S. commander in Iraq, I think it was Ricardo Sanchez at that time, even was reamed out by President Bush and others, said this is not what we're all about. So I think the IDF has got a problem on their hands, and it also just is one of those where when you only have 10 to 15%, that's just a propaganda disaster. If, you know, they didn't find a suicide vest, and then people were like, well, why did they have weapons in the first place? Another lesson that we all learned in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Syria, a lot of people in these places have guns, a lot of normal citizens, just like we do. They've got rifles and other things, not only protect their own property, it's actually a deep part of Arab culture now at this point. So, you know, a lot of their explanations just do not really rise to what they initially put out there. And some of their propagandists here in the West who were like, well, this is exactly how America dealt with POWs in Iraq. It's like, no, we actually did not do that, very intentionally. And then ask anybody who served 05, 06, you know, and all the way throughout. Unless you were a Guantanamo-type detainee, you were not seeing something like this.
It is sort of remarkable to see the just like reflexive pro-Israel voices online just auto-defend these photos and cheer them. Also cheer them. Say, oh, this is Hamas surrendering and this is great, this is fantastic, this is fully justified. And then even the IDF having to come out and apologize for these images and distance themselves. Oh, this wasn't us. We had nothing to do with this. Okay, then who was it? Who released the photos? Who was it who took the photos? Who was it who took these multiple videos that ultimately emerged? And, you know, the first thing that came to mind for me was actually there was a deeply researched piece about how the FBI sort of intentionally radicalized this young Muslim man. This was classic war on terror era tactics, to effectively radicalize these young men and then entrap them in some sort of a plot so that they could be, oh, look at us, we're disrupting terrorism, we're keeping people safe, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, these plots never would have been hatched if the FBI wasn't pushing them in that direction anyway. But in one of these instances, I believe it was for this man who supposedly was going to bomb Herald Square, it was the images of Abu Ghraib that they used to try to get him on the path to radicalization. This was the most effective propaganda tool for our own FBI in radicalizing people, and obviously for Islamist jihadists to radicalize young men to their cause. So when you think about the core goal here, which I think is total bullshit for reasons that we've discussed previously, but the idea that, we're going to eradicate Hamas, you are creating more militants. You are radicalizing people far more effectively than you are. You're certainly not de-radicalizing anyone, and you're doing it far more effectively radicalizing people than you are at actually identifying and capturing Hamas militants or killing them on the battlefield. So let's also be clear. Put this next piece up on the screen. This is putting us at risk because around the world, it is very clear that we are 100% behind Israel's actions. So when things like this emerge, it's not just the Israelis who are taking the blowback here, it's also us. Case in point here, the US stood alone in the world to veto this UN resolution that not only demanded an immediate ceasefire, but also called for the release of all the hostages. So you can't even pretend this is like about the hostages, we have to get the hostages. No, this resolution called for the release of the hostages. This is the 15-member Security Council. The vote was 13-1. We were the one, by the way, with the UK abstaining. It says in this article, the U.S.'s isolated stand reflected a growing fracture between Washington and some of its closest allies over Israel's months-long bombardment of Gaza. France and Japan were among those supporting the call for a ceasefire. We also enabled the Russians to grandstand here, saying that history will judge Washington's actions in the face of what the Russian deputy UN ambassador called a merciless Israeli bloodbath. So all of
he's one to talk.
Right, well, exactly. Absolutely. Right. But as these images emerge, as we learn more about the atrocities being committed on the ground, keep in mind, those are US-made bombs. Everyone sees through Biden's little leak into the press of, oh, we're so concerned, or Tony Blinken coming out, oh, too many innocent civilians have been killed. Everyone sees through that. Everyone knows Washington has greenlit all of these actions. We stand behind Israel. We say there's no red lines. We have done nothing other than leak to the press how morally concerned we are to actually stop any of this from happening. So it's not just people being radicalized against Israel, it's them being radicalized against us too. So keep that in mind when you see any of these images emerging here.
I'm very worried about it. I really am. And I just think I'm going to apply the same logic that I did to Ukraine. Is Israel an ally? Yeah. Is it worth the level of blowback? And now just think about this too. It's been 2 straight months, even on this show and every other show. This is the #1 topic of conversation for a faraway third world ethnic conflict, which is what it is at the end of the day. Does it really bear the total obsession of the global elite? And then think about this, about all the people in the region and about our support in the same way that we had everybody turn against us after Iraq, even though everybody was with us after 9/11. I'm really worried about and Glenn Greenwald's been making this point as well, about polarizing the rest of the world against us. First, we did it on Ukraine, a conflict which, again, has no bearing on any of us. You could actually make a better argument, I think, for for the situation in Ukraine has more effect on U.S. national security than you can for Israel. And yet, that is what our elites and all this stuff decided is the #1 single most important thing. I think it's literal madness. And we're exerting all this foreign policy and bleeding all of this soft power and capital abroad for what? And we very rarely have gotten very much out of this deal, but there are powerful political constituencies here in America who this is their soul. This is what they have worked for 75 years, and they've been very, very successful at doing it. So I guess congratulations to all of them.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.